Woo! We're over halfway through this series! Finishing off our duo of year-ending waves, we have Wave 3. This wave was kind of a transition in that I feel like this one overall groups in better with the year 2 waves than it does with the others in year 1. By that, I mainly mean that this one was easily the least held back by being in the front half of the booster course pass. Waves 1 and 2, while having good track picks in their own right, fell flat in a few ways. Their city tracks were generally simpler and less ambitious, with Sydney being the biggest exception. Both waves also had circuit track picks that felt like obligatory early wave picks. Like Toad Circuit in Wave 1 was mostly there to serve as a starter course rep, and it would have been surprising if one of the SNES picks wasn't a Mario Circuit. There were still some cool track picks mixed in to keep things interesting, but generally everything through Wave 2 felt pretty safe, for lack of better words. Wave 3 is where the booster course pass really started to pick up though, and is widely regarded as one of the DLC's best. While there were some pretty obvious inclusions, this wave feels like it was built to throw us off, with us getting multiple tracks that weren't even in tour when the BCP was first revealed, and throw us off they did. Kinda. See, when Wave 2 launched, people were quick to data mine the game files like they did in Wave 1 just in case any revealing information was left in. Revealing is an understatement. Wave 1 gave us the banner and prefix leaks, both of which had some pretty revealing information, but ultimately the biggest takeaway was there were a few soft reveals of tracks through either making connections based on prefixes or deciphering what the tiny blurry track images on the banner were. Definitely revealing stuff, but nothing specific enough for us to know how future waves would play out. Wave 2, on the other hand, had a handful of prefetch music files left in. If you don't know what a prefetch is, don't worry, I didn't either. All you have to know is they gave us a glimpse at the first second or so of the music for a bunch of upcoming courses. The file names also told us exactly what wave and what track slot these files were associated with. So if the file name said 3-1, that was Wave 3 Track 1, or if it was 48, that is Wave 4 Track 8. This, of course, was the most revealing information we got during the entire release of the BCP. Not only did we now know the placements of every single city track currently in tour up to that point, the only ones not present being Athens, Rome, and Madrid, but we also got a hefty chunk of retro tracks, including every single track planned for Wave 3. This was a huge deal that really shook up speculation. Pretty much all focus shifted to figuring out what was coming in year 2 of the DLC, while we waited for Wave 3 to finally drop and be out of the way. Nintendo is Nintendo though, and they had a few curveballs up their sleeves, which ultimately made Wave 3 a huge game changer in more ways than one. So let's finally talk about the tracks themselves. As per usual, we're going to start with a look at the city tracks. Wave 3 features London Loop and Berlin Byways. This is definitely the point where city tracks started to get more complex, for better or for worse. Personally, I prefer these over the simpler cities in the first 2 waves, but I'll also concede that this was the point when the city tracks started to get kinda confusing. I feel like I remember London Loop being the one that tripped me up the most this wave, but I think some of that comes down to a few things. London Loop, like Wave 3, is a bit of a transitionary track within tour itself. It was the start of more interesting city layouts for sure, but it also suffers from a lot of the same problems earlier cities did, where you're mostly driving down a bunch of samey looking roads that don't have very distinct sections. Heck, most of the more distinct sections here end up blending in with similar sections elsewhere in the track. The only really noticeably unique part of this track is the short market section, but even then that is mitigated by the new use of an alternate outside route that happens to be faster. London is an okay city track, and I guess it stands out somewhat among the first 3 waves of cities, but compared to what's to come, it simply never stood a chance. One thing I will give it though is the music. London Loop has infamously one of the most mediocre music tracks among all of Tour's nitros. In the months leading up to Wave 3 though, I had faith. The music may not have worked well in Tour due to the use of digital instruments, but Mario Kart 8 uses live recordings, and they have proven that they can do well with basically any genre thrown at them. So I held the belief that London Loop's music had potential that would be unleashed when the Mario Kart band got their hands on it, and I was absolutely not disappointed. In general, Wave 3 was one of the best when it came to music, with the Rock Cup specifically having some of my favorite music in the entire game. Before we get to that though, we have to cover our other city track, which also happens to have an absolute banger of a music track. Berlin Byways is a track I was looking forward to before even Wave 2 released, purely because of the music. The combination of dubstep and orchestral music works surprisingly well. It makes for one of the most unique music tracks in the entire series. It also goes surprisingly hard in general, and if you haven't heard either version yet, definitely go and give it a clean listen. What I like here too is that the Mario Kart 8 version of this music is different enough that it doesn't completely replace the original. This is especially noticeable in the techno section, but the orchestra section is also a lot punchier. Deciding which version is better genuinely just comes down to personal preference. Now I just rambled about the music, but we haven't even talked about the track itself yet. Unfortunately, in terms of the city courses, this is one of the more mid ones. I mean that in a literal sense, because I feel like it is distinct enough to not group in with the simple early city courses, but doesn't quite have that extra punch that more recent city tracks have. In a lot of ways, it feels like Madrid Drive Light. Both tracks have very similar aesthetics, but Berlin has fewer and less memorable distinct set pieces. There's a train station you drive through in lap 1, as well as a couple monuments here and there that you actually get to drive through. Looking at you, early cities. And a very clever use of womps at the Berlin Wall. Aside from that though, the track is almost entirely just roads, though it does make a little more sense here. In Tour, Berlin 3 is a traffic course, so in the BCP version, the traffic is constantly flowing through those parts of the track, meaning that even on other laps, anywhere that intersects with that route will still have moving traffic. Berlin Byways is a pretty decent city track in my opinion, but it simply gets hardcore overshadowed by most other city tracks when taking the DLC as a whole into consideration. At least it will always stand out for its music. Moving on to the actual retros, this is where our curveballs come in. Before Wave 3 leaked, we knew what the prefixes were for its tracks, so we knew we were going to be getting tracks from the GBA and DS here. When the music tracks leaked, we were all caught off guard because both of these tracks ended up being complete surprises at the time, being one of the 2 GBA Ghost tracks and Peach Gardens. Neither of these tracks were leaked for Tour at the time, as far as I'm aware at least, and neither were tracks anyone was actively predicting either. Of course, this didn't matter too much as both tracks were in Tour by the time Wave 3 released, but considering there was otherwise no reason to expect either, it was definitely a shock. When Peach Gardens was revealed for Wave 3 in the September 2022 Nintendo Direct, it pretty much confirmed that the data mine was trustworthy and was, to some extent at least, reliable. Peach Gardens ended up having its own surprises. At first glance, it may seem pretty par for the course for what one would expect the track to be like remade in HD, but there were some pretty significant changes made. Firstly, the maze section was completely redone, having its row count reduced, but also having some of the bushes turned into sculptures of even more Mario characters, which I think really adds to the overall appeal of the track, since the only thing we had like that beforehand was that one Mario hedge at the beginning. The off-road was also placed in less awkward spots compared to the original, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on who you ask. Personally, I'm mixed on it as it reduces the difficulty, but it does at least help the track flow better. One of the sections was completely redone, now having a piranha plant to avoid. The biggest change though was on the third lap, where they pull a bit of a calamari desert and have the tour arrows direct you into a new area. This time, however, the new section is fairly short, but it's used to direct you back onto the main path backwards. So now you drive on Peach Gardens R from Tour. I say that specifically because the glider ramp from that variant of the track is present here also. I honestly wish they would have done more stuff like this in other retros in the DLC, But unfortunately, this was the last time this kind of thing happened. Maybe in the next game. The other surprising retro that leaked was GBA Boo Lake. Though we didn't know for certain at the initial leak that it would be this, since it was equally likely it could be Broken Pier. That October rolled around though, and with it came confirmation through Tor that the GBA Ghost track would indeed be Boo Lake. I absolutely love what they did here in Tor, and my biggest hope for this track going into Wave 3 was that the underwater section would be anti-gravity, since it felt like the Tor version was absolutely begging for this to be the case. Thankfully, I got my wish. Boo Lake as a whole is just a very solid Ghost track. It isn't overly complicated, but it is super satisfying to play on, especially hitting those tricks right at the end when you're coming out of the water. I'm super happy that they kept the bridge shortcut too. Also, I feel like the music here is a bit underrated, and I don't like just throwing that term around. I see nobody talk about the music here, but holy hell this shit bangs. Those drums in the main section go so hard, and it is an absolute rarity for me to skip this one when it shuffles on my music. Good stuff. The next two tracks I want to talk about were both very expected going into this wave, being 3DS Rock Mountain and Tor Merry Mountain. Lots of mountain tracks in the past, as I'm realizing. Merry Mountain was simply always going to be in Wave 3. Like, that just wasn't not going to happen. From the start, one could deduce that Waves 3 and 6 were probably going to fall around the holidays, and considering Merry Mountain, the Christmas track, was one of the only two non-city nitros in Tor at the time, it was pretty obvious it would be in Wave 3. As expected, it leaked for this wave in the music leak, and was even the first track teased for this wave, showing up in the September Direct alongside Peach Gardens. The presence of this track actually led me to form a theory on when Wave 3 would launch that ended up being fairly accurate, all things considered, given the tour I expected Merry Mountain to show up in came one slot later than I thought it would, but otherwise the theory held ground. I will say, I'm glad this was the only non-city nitro that didn't end a cup. It's a fine track, but it's just too simple to be a cup ender. It's borderline a glorified oval, but I do think there's an extent where calling it that is discrediting the track a little too much. Aesthetically, it nails the holiday theming, and I love the train that flies around. The alternate route on the train tracks toward the start is really neat, and this is the track most people credit with bringing half pipes back into 8 since they were shown off at the end of the direct teaser. The end is unfortunately a bit bare bones since it's just a straightaway down the mountain, though at least this version has anti-gravity and accompanying spin boost to at least give you something to do. It's definitely not the best tour nitro, but it's a harmless addition, and I'm glad I don't have to wait to play it only 2 weeks out of the year. Yep. Rock Mountain! Yeah, so this was another track I was looking forward to purely because I wanted to hear the live rendition of its music. Yet again, I was not disappointed and we got an absolute banger. The funny thing here is that basically everyone called it appearing in this cup specifically since the BCP was announced. I and many others saw there was a rock cup and immediately jumped to thinking about how fitting it would be if Rock Mountain was included in it. Clearly Nintendo was thinking the same thing. Now there's a couple elephants in the room I need to tackle. The first is that gliding in this game is a lot different than it was in 7, which unfortunately messes with a lot of the gameplay here since this is the gliding track. I especially noticed this when trying to take some of the pipe wind shortcuts and almost always fall short. It may just be a skill issue, but I remember these working a lot better originally. The other is the graphics, which personally I will say I really like the Brown Mountain and kind of prefer it over the original in some ways. The only real issue I have here is the lack of texturing, which thankfully they at least got it together for Koopa Cape in Wave 5, which has the same style of mountain. But I really wish they would have gone back and redone this track eventually because among all the other Wave 3 tracks, this one just sticks out, which is super unfortunate. I'm glad they more or less fully got things figured out for the second year waves at least. All of this said though, I do still love this track and am super happy it's here. I'm especially happy that the hill climb at the end is finally anti-gravity, because let's be real, that shit was always meant to be that way. Now we move on to this wave's headliners, starting off with the biggest surprise of the wave that would go on to have larger implications for the future of the Booster Course Pass. The original prefix data mine suggested that the second track of Wave 3's Moon Cup would be our first GameCube track of the entire DLC. Later, when Wave 2 dropped, this track slot was revealed to be Waluigi Stadium, lining up with the banner data mine. As most of you know though, the second track of the Moon Cup in the final version of Wave 3 is DS Peach Gardens. So what exactly happened? In the weeks leading up to Wave 3's full reveal, a leaker who accurately teased the entirety of Wave 2's lineup teased Wave 3, beginning a rumor that the wave was restructured and that there was a track swap. This turned out to be true, and Waluigi Stadium ended up getting pushed out of Wave 3. Taking its place, originally being planned for Wave 6, was Wii Maple Treeway. At the time, this made a lot of sense. Originally, there is a Wii track in every wave aside from 3, but Wave 6 had 2, so it seemed fairly reasonable to even things out. The decision to move Waluigi Stadium specifically felt odd to me though, since that meant we were theoretically getting a wave later on with 2 GameCube tracks, since there was no reason at the time to believe that this was all more than just a restructuring to combat leaks. In retrospect though, this was very telling, since we ended up having some prefixes invalidated at the end, including whatever GameCube track was originally set to come in Wave 6. Back to Maple Treeway though, it's very good. Honestly, I don't know what to tell you here. It's pretty much Maple Treeway but in HD. The wigglers move differently and are easier to avoid due to it, and the net bridge is still replaced with a glider section, which I personally think is more fitting to the track anyway. The half pipe is back like it was in Tour, and since this comes before Merry Mountain within Wave 3's track order, that means that this is the reintroduction to half pipes in both Tour and 8 Deluxe, which I think is super fitting. Also, thank God they retextured this, because if this track was released in Wave 1, it probably would have looked closer to this, and that is such a dodged bullet, it is insane. Our final track is also the final track of Wave 3, and they definitely ended with a bang. I'd been anticipating the arrival of 3DS Rainbow Road since the start of the Booster Course Pass. It is my all-time favorite Rainbow Road, and it was already in Tour, since very early on at that. So it felt like a shoo-in for the DLC. I also think it is very fitting that it fell in the Moon Cup, and I know there was a certain point where the thought of it popping up here crossed my mind, even before the prefix leak, which all but confirmed it in my eyes. I'm glad to see that if they were going to go all out with the looks of any tracks in the past, it was the Rainbow Roads. You can tell they really put in the work too, because it looks completely different here than it does in Tour. I see complaints that it's too blue, but honestly, that doesn't bother me too much. It's very distinct looking, and I like how it has that classic translucent look to it that the other Rainbow Roads in 8 were kinda missing before now. As for the gameplay, yeah, the track doesn't have all the crazy banks in the road that the original had on some of its turns. You can thank the Tour model for that. To be honest though, those were far from critical to this track. The most memorable part of this Rainbow Road was exploring this solar system and driving around on all these planets, moons, and asteroids. 3DS Rainbow Road is the space track in a lot of ways, and as long as they nail that, they've gotten everything they need. They absolutely did, and I'm stoked to finally have an HD version of this track. I'm glad it didn't take decades for it to happen either. The Wave 3 update was smaller than those that followed, but it did add one absolutely game-changing feature, being a custom item toggle for versus and battle mode. This is one of those features I know I was hoping to get for a long time, and I'm honestly surprised it took them this long to add it to any Mario Kart game. Now we no longer need mods to play a Blue Shells only game, and we can turn on pure mushrooms only if we want to practice shortcuts without the limitations of time trials. Not to mention all of the item combos we can now do to essentially create our own new game modes. This feature needs to be a staple in future games. Anyway, that's pretty much all for Wave 3. This wave is still one of the biggest standouts of the past and is easy to see why, with it featuring 2 major fan favorites and a group of remaining tracks that are all hella solid in their own rights. Not to mention some of the best music in the entire game. Next time, we get to finally go in chronological order for once and talk about Wave 4. Only 2 more waves left, but from now, we pause for a few months just as we did 2 years ago. Until then, bye!
I'll be real, I can't think of an end edit, so I'm just gonna put this clip in its entirety on here because it needs to be preserved somehow. Enjoy.